Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Adams. I'm president of Balancing Act. We're an organization that focuses very specifically on public engagement and especially public engagement on the budget. We are very pleased today to have a special presentation by a leader in the field in public engagement who has been doing some research to try to understand the state of the situation in terms of local governments across the country in thinking about budget engagement. So Larry Schooler is going to be the main presenter today. Larry first came to our attention a few years ago when he was, at that point, manager of community engagement for the city of Austin, a city that's known for excellence in that area, and he helped establish there and build some of their community engagement on the budget, and has really been an exemplar in the field. He wrote an article that we came across about some work that the city of San Antonio had been doing that in some ways captures the irony or the paradox regarding budget engagement. The title was "It's Your Money, Where's Your Say?" And he sort of laid out the paradox between the level of engagement and interest and ability to participate in thinking through budget decisions and budget policy with the importance of that area with the sort of lack of interest and lack of participation. And one of the things that we here at Balancing Act believe is that it's not that people don't care about those things, it's that they don't have a good way to learn about this complex, obtuse area such as of the budget, and they don't have a good way to provide input. And so that's one thing that we've been working on quite a bit lately. And Larry is very thoughtful on that. He wrote about the experience of San Antonio in terms of having some significant success in this area. So we've invited Larry to talk to folks that are somehow associated with us. Some of you are current users of our software, and some of you, I think, just found us somehow, and we're glad to have everyone. I think there's a real diversity and mix of backgrounds and experience. So Larry's going to spend most of his time, at least initially, sharing what he's been learning. He did a survey of 100 or so local government folks recently. He's going to share that, and then we're going to open it up for questions and comments and discussion. My colleague, Brenda Morrison, is also on, and she may chime in with some questions. We really do welcome all of you to ask questions. There should be a little button or an icon to raise your hand. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Larry said he's happy to be interrupted if you want to ask a question during his presentation. And we're just looking for a lively opportunity to sort of get an understanding of what the state of the field is, and also to learn from each other. So having said that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Larry, and take just a second to change things over, and then we'll go. But once again, please do ask questions if you have them.
Thank you very much, Chris, and I'm assuming everybody can hear me okay. Chris, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thanks for being with me and with us today. I'm delighted to be a guest of Chris's and Brenda's. I've admired their work for quite some time, and I hope that folks will forgive me this little double entendre in my title, but I thought it was important. Of course, this is not a webinar about the census by any means, but I was sort of intending a couple of different meanings with the title of today's webinar. You know, one is just the idea of making the voices of the people and their input count when it comes to making decisions about how their money is spent. But I think feel it's important to try to make people actually count how the money is being spent, meaning that there's often a request or a plea for more funding to be spent on something, or for taxes to be reduced, without regard for the consequences of that, whether it be to themselves or to other people. And obviously the folks at the Balancing Act have thought a lot about that. And so my purpose here is to kind of share with you some of what I'm learning about what's happening right now in this regard, but also to kind of make offer some suggestions as to how we can encourage greater and more productive engagement in the budget, and as well as other public spending discussions than has been the case, I think, up to now. So I think it's important to kind of set the table and lay a baseline for what we're really talking about. So when it comes to engagement in and of itself, which often is interchanged with public participation. There's a number of other terms that get bandied about, but I tend to err on the side of public participation or public engagement. And I fall back on a definition from the International Association for Public Participation, which is shown there on the left-hand side of the screen. The reason I think this is important is that a lot of times I think when people say engagement, they may mean just hosting an event or providing people with information. And while I think that's very much important and critical to success in budget making and spending decisions, I think that what we're talking about here is really giving the public a say, a role, an opportunity to participate in some way in the decision-making process. They're not going to necessarily make the ultimate decision, and very seldom do we give that final decision to the public, but they will, in theory, be affecting the decision because they're affected by it, and that's kind of the working theory here. And then there's what do we mean when we say a budget? And I turned to the National Advisory Council on State and Local Budgeting to share this definition. And what really fascinated me was the way they defined the mission of the budget process, which is, as you can see, to help decision makers make informed choices and to promote stakeholder participation in the process, which I think is a remarkable statement of purpose by the National Advisory Council when it comes to state and local governmental budgeting. Of course, I think the same would apply to federal budgets. I think it's not hard to imagine spending decisions that we are affected by that we want to affect. If our spouse wants to buy a car, we'd like to have some say in how much is going to be spent on the car, which car it's going to be. Same thing for a house. Same thing for maybe our children's school choice and tuition. There's any number of things that we could think about spending our money on, or that someone is going to spend our money on, that we would want to have a say beforehand. And I think it's also pretty evident in a lot of cases around the country that sometimes people develop an opposition to a particular concept or idea or proposal, not necessarily because of the substance of the proposal, but in fact because they weren't consulted. And I'd love, if there's any psychology majors on the webinar, I'd love to get your theories about why that occurs. I think it's just a function of wanting to feel heard, wanting to feel important and respected. And I think part of what we're after here is creating a better process both for the listeners, which is to say government agencies, and the folks who are talking, in this case the public, so that both sides can feel like they're being heard, that the city or state or county feels that the public really is understanding the decisions that the agency faces and respects those, and at the same time that the public feels that their sentiments are being heard and that budgets are being adjusted to meet their particular preferences. So I think it's important to kind of think beyond just the basic definition of engagement and think about sort of guiding principles, if you will. And these bullet points are taken from probably about 24 different sets of public engagement principles statements that have come out across the continent, including up in Canada, from various cities, counties, state agencies, and whatnot. And I think most of them are self-explanatory, but I want to just call out a couple. One is the notion of ongoing education, which I think is sometimes hard to achieve. We're often in government rushing from one project to the next. And I think the unique aspect of a budget is, of course, that it's an annual endeavor, sometimes even more frequently than that. And it's important for us to consider how our conversation with the budget can occur, not just at budget passage time, but over the course of a year, the entire year, or perhaps at least the portion of the year when the budget is under development. And then I think the other particular bullet point here that I think is really relevant is the notion of accessibility and information provision, which is to say most of the budgets that I've ever looked at or read are accessible probably to the people who wrote them and perhaps the elected officials and perhaps some others who had a hand in drafting their own department's budgets. And I say that not to cast aspersions or throw under the bus budget writers, budget officers by any stretch. I think they are doing what they need to do in order to deliver the product that can then function as the agency budget. But I think that one of the things that the public is missing is a clearer understanding of exactly where their money is going, exactly how it's being spent, and perhaps even more importantly than all of those things, what the outcomes are of the way their money is being spent. It's one thing to say, we're spending $20 million on our park system, but in the absence of knowing either how that compares to other places or what the results of that spending are in terms of programming and park space and accessibility and all that, it's hard to render any judgment. So we'll talk a little bit more as we go along about how, in fact, to make some of this information a little bit more accessible. And then finally on the screen, I just want to call attention to the notion of promoting dialogue and deliberation and discussion and listening. In other words, I think we often think of public input or for that matter, any sort of public, release of information as being kind of a one-directional thing. The agency puts out materials, whether it be a press release or a social media post or the actual budget on a website, and provides information about it for the public to receive. And then oftentimes the public shows up at a hearing to make their case or their plea for their particular pet project or service or what have you. Dialogue is different. Dialogue and deliberation are different. Anybody who's ever had a conversation can tell you that it's an iterative process. It involves, the sharing of viewpoints from one side, the response from another side, and an exchange that hopefully at least leads to greater understanding on both sides, if not perhaps some consensus or common ground towards the end. And the whole notion of deliberation is this idea that, a group of people working together can consider the various options before them and come to a decision that will benefit the whole. And that's not to say that city councils and state legislatures can't do some of that, but I think that one thing we're starting to see emerge as a trend across the United States, and it's already taken hold in places like Canada and Australia and parts of Europe, is the notion that the public should deliberate, not simply the elected officials, that the public should be able to have a more in-depth conversation about policy decisions that will affect them, and then that should be conveyed to those ultimately making the decision. So, that still leaves the question for why specifically we should get any sort of special level of engagement when it comes to budgets or spending decisions. And for my money, pardon the pun, this is some of what comes to mind. I think, for one thing, it clearly is helpful politically to those in elected office, those who might be seeking re-election, those aspiring to higher office, when they're able to demonstrate that they have heard the people's voice. And frankly, you need look no further than the first couple of pages of the New York Times or many other media in the recent days to see the ramifications of this. As some of you may know, the French President Emmanuel Macron finds himself in unbelievably hot water relative to some spending and budgetary and tax decisions that he's made without much, if any, public input in mind, and in fact has reversed many of them in the face of street protests and demonstrations. Now, it may seem like that's a faraway issue, but of course that's a democracy and a close ally historically of the United States, and it's not unheard of for the public, when they face a situation where they feel excluded from a major decision, to express themselves in a way that is very disruptive to the conduct of government, the performance of government, to the undertakings of elected officials. So I think it's important not to gloss over that. Many of us on this webinar are probably not in elected office or in political positions per se, but we can't discount the significance of that in the context of public budgeting. I also think in the same vein that the more the public is involved in a particular spending decision, the easier it might be for them to stomach it. Witness some of the efforts made by former San Antonio Mayor Julian Castro, who successfully sought a tax increase to pay for, I believe it's early childhood education and preschool type programming. In cases where it's simply a decision handed down on high, that's going to be a lot harder for people to accept. But when people feel as if they've gotten a chance to have a say, and where I am right now, there was a large extended effort to get input on a ballot measure to raise money for transportation taxes that passed. So I think it's partly about the campaign, but it's also about letting people have a say in these tougher decisions. It also makes sure that the governments are doing what they ought to be doing as governments, meaning that, if we have a clearer sense of what the public wants to spend their tax dollars on, that enables the government agency to really target services and programs where they are most needed. And there have been a number of studies particularly in the UK. And for folks that are interested, I can send you some links offline that have specifically examined that particular notion. Then, of course, it can also increase people's satisfaction levels with the services they have. In other words, if money is allocated to parks, but it's not being allocated, for example, to restrooms or to grass maintenance or what have you, that may sort of miss the boat in terms of giving parks more funding. So it's important to make sure that we understand as specifically as we can what the public is after in terms of particular spending changes, so that they then may make higher and better use of the services. And then I think it's going to save money in the long run, because it's kind of the metaphor I always use is that of the difference between going to a primary care doctor for an office visit compared to the emergency room. If you've had an opportunity to kind of keep the public watching the spending trends and the budgetary trends that you're experiencing, and then can come to them at a certain point and say, we need your help, that they are going to help you make those decisions that could result in cuts to spending, could result in tax increases that increase revenue. But in the long run, you're sort of investing up front in something more preventative and curative than investing towards the end of a process where you could be faced with a crisis and just have to sort of hastily make spending decisions that aren't going to pay off as well. So it might be a little bit more of an upfront investment in terms of getting deeper and more meaningful engagement, but I think it pays off in the form of, frankly, happier residents and citizens who are happier with services, who then take advantage of those more often and overall benefit the public entity more. I do want to draw your attention to a study that actually, of all places, came out of Russia, and some participatory budgeting work done in Russia. I know that it may seem completely counterintuitive to consider Russia to be a place where there could be anything to learn related to democratic participation. But nevertheless, this study did examine some trends around involving the public directly in how to spend money at a local level, not at a federal level. And some of the bullet points that I've drawn here come directly from the study that's linked on the screen. So hopefully we can make these slides available to you afterwards, and you can track down that study to take a look for yourself.
Hey, Larry, this is Brenda, I just want to interrupt you just quickly. If anyone has any questions so far on what Larry said, please go ahead and ask away. Either you can do it by chat or raising your hand, and Larry's got control, and he can answer any questions. So if you do have any questions on anything he said, please don't hesitate.
Thank you very much, Brenda. I appreciate that. So I want to then share with you a little bit about what I learned over the course of doing this survey. So as Chris mentioned, it went out to essentially my local government network, or I should say my government network, probably about a few hundred or so people who I know from various levels of government across the country. And in fact, we even had a response from Europe. And so we asked, as you know, some multiple choice questions. And the first was just to understand exactly how much is happening right now in terms of input on budgetary or spending decisions. And I was actually a little bit surprised to see, some 57% of folks say that it's actually happening pretty frequently or at a pretty decent clip. As you see the legend there on the right. It's not all that surprising to see, roughly 42 or so percent say not a whole lot at all, really. Because I think that, again, we're dealing with a concept that can be very difficult to, boil down in a way that the public is really going to understand. But nevertheless, I think that it's encouraging to see that more and more governments are taking a point of involving the public in some of these decisions. So let's see. I saw a question saying it'd be great if I could share the slides. I think we should be able to. I'll confirm that with Chris here in just a minute. So I think it's helpful as we look at this graph and see that it's not certainly a universal decision or consensus to do a lot of input engagement on budgeting, to understand why it might not happen more than it does. Again, I think it's partly just the real opacity of it. Just the fact that it's so it can be so esoteric to someone who's not accustomed to reading these things, to really get their hands around what it's really saying. And I think in a moment I'll probably show you an example of sort of an effort to decipher this a little bit more for the public to sort of get what the meaning of a budget might be. I also think, though, that it's important to recognize that in general terms, public engagement often happens in the greatest numbers when people perceive there to be a significant crisis. Now, it may be a crisis of their own making, which is to say that a zoning case that might seem innocuous to the planning department seems like an existential threat to the surrounding neighbors, and so that could be a crisis that draws people out in big numbers. But just generally, I mean, in my say 10 or 12 years of doing this work, have noticed that the largest attendance often is at those meetings where there seems to be something really looming that has people very apprehensive. When it comes to doing sort of proactive engagement, sometimes the attendance or levels of engagement can be lower. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's so critical to make use of a whole range of tools to engage the public on spending decisions, and to do so at multiple times in a given year, not just at budget time. Because if you wait till budget time, you're essentially laying this enormous, repository of information and data at their feet and expecting them to grasp it in short order. And they're probably not going to take the time to do so, especially if they don't think there's a big crisis looming. So I think that it's important just to recognize, not to, of course, manufacture a crisis, but to simply acknowledge that unless you're facing a major crisis, a big shortfall, or some other, problematic issue, you're probably not going to see tons and tons of people at a meeting on this topic unless it's framed in a very compelling way, or unless you utilize some other tools. And then in that same vein, I think it's important to say that, and I could obviously do a whole webinar just on this topic, but most people, I'm saying most, I mean, I think in the 98 to 99% range, find the prospect of going to a public meeting to be simply impossible, completely unheard of. They either are not wanting to go during a time of day that has something else in it, like the workday or family time or a commitment they've made to another organization. So I think there's just the inconvenience of going, not to mention, what if I'm not as comfortable speaking English? What if I have kids and need to bring them? Are there activities for the kids? If it's their dinner time, is there refreshment? But then there's just this whole idea of it being kind of an uncomfortable situation. I mean, most quote unquote town hall meetings or public hearings are structured in a way that there's just this kind of open microphone that people are expected to walk up to and start talking. And so as a result, I think that intimidates people. Most of us just don't feel that comfortable participating in that way. We need to diversify our portfolio of engagement tools so that we're appealing to people who may not be particularly outspoken, big speech givers, but can nevertheless, have something to say, have something helpful to contribute, and would do so if it were presented in a more compelling way. A question just came in from Tara Olson asking, does the City of Austin have any videos or visual promotions to help educate the public on how government budgets work? Would love to help share this to the public via City of Austin platforms if we have one. The City of Austin did, Tara, when I was there, produce a really great video with animation that shows kind of how the budget is put together and how we spend our money. And it's available on the City of Austin's YouTube channel, which is, I'll put it in the chat window for those who don't pay attention to that, but it's youtube.com/Austin, Texas GOV. And you'd have to do a search, but I mean, it's something like Budget Basics video, I believe, should get you to what I think is a pretty good overview video, and hopefully it's still being utilized. I've been away for just a year or so. So another part of the poll question, you're welcome. Another part of the poll question was, that the survey was, which of the following engagement methods does your agency use to let the public weigh in on budgetary or spending decisions? And not a whole lot surprised me here either. I think I was surprised to see such a large percentage of the respondents say that they used an online simulation, like perhaps Balancing Act. Survey was pretty high. The top vote getter was kind of public hearing or town hall meeting. And presumably when people said workshop, they understood there was sort of a difference there, that a workshop implies kind of more of an interactive, maybe small group discussion, or maybe the use of, computer stations to give input, as opposed to a hearing where it's more about, giving speeches to a body or to an audience. But, it's interesting that there are quite a number of folks who are interested, I think, in going beyond just that basic meeting to do other things, but it's still somewhat limited. But you see here, online simulation, focus group, and so on. So it's interesting to see that there is a diversity of engagement methods happening even now. This I think is really probably one of the more interesting findings, which is, even if you think that there is a decent amount of engagement in the budget at your agency right now, to what extent do you think we should do more? As you see, I mean, something like 74% of the responding public said a little or a lot should happen more than is already happening. Very few thought that the status quo was okay. And I think, one question I didn't ask that I might want to ask in a future survey is what's limiting that investment now? And I think it could go back to some of these things that we talked about before, that there's just it's not always seen as a compelling priority in the realm of engagement work, but I think it certainly should be. But then we sort of got into, well, what more could we do? If in fact more should be done, what more should we do? And so I would say that the answers, these were free response questions, open-ended questions, and I would say that this is kind of the way they came out in terms of some themes. I mean, one was just this notion of it not being something that's held just for budget time, that in fact it should be something that happens on a regular basis, where the public is getting information and perhaps able to give input on how things are going with the budget. Perhaps revenues are coming in lower than we expected or higher. Perhaps the recession, there's a recession nationally that's having an impact that we should know about. So something that's more than just an episodic kind of engagement once or twice a year, but perhaps something that's more ongoing, web resources and the like, to give people a view under the hood, so to speak. And then also a desire for kind of greater levels of transparency. In other words, not just having the budget available, not just having, kind of technical data available on an open data portal, but really clarifying and elucidating for people what exactly is going on. They are spending, X amount on property and sales taxes, and in exchange, here's some of the outcomes they're getting. Not just here's how much money is being spent, but here's some of the outcomes that they're getting through the use of that money, and here's how the money is being used. Again, I think that's something that, in the absence of it, can create problems when there wasn't necessarily a problem to begin with. But if people kind of discover that money is being spent in a way they didn't realize, that can easily become a political crisis where there didn't need to be one. So the greater levels of transparency, I think, are something that a lot of people buy into. I think probably one of the most repeated themes in the open-ended responses was just this whole idea of discussing trade-offs. That to me is kind of at the heart of what spending and budget engagement should be all about. In almost every circumstance when it comes to public policy, there are trade-offs, and they could be fiscal or financial, or they could be in another form. We're going to put more density in a particular part of the city, which could produce a trade-off of more traffic congestion. But in a spending or budgetary context, obviously, if the city council or state legislature is hoping to keep taxes level, that could mean that fewer people get services if the population grows and the revenues don't keep up with the needs to the expense of providing a particular service. Or if it's a commitment on the part of the elected officials to reduce taxes, maybe they think they're too high, or maybe they ran on that platform, then obviously that means that services could be cut. So of course there are trade-offs associated with just about every spending decision that a public agency is going to make, but I think it's more rare for an agency to be able to present those to the public, to explain to them what's at stake, and to ask them how they would address that trade-off, how they would come down on that. There's going to be a trade-off one way or another, but we'd like to know how you would actually deal with it. And then I think a lot of people talked about expanding the reach of engagement. And of course, there's all kinds of things that we could do to make a face-to-face public meeting more appealing, including having a presence at other well-attended public events, having various forms of entertainment or amenities like food and refreshment and child care activities and interpreters and so on. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, we've got to be ensuring that we're leveraging technology in the most effective and appropriate ways possible. That doesn't mean, set up a Facebook page and hope for the best. It means, kind of laying out a set of tools that would really help enhance the number of folks and the different kinds of populations that you're able to hear from over the course of your engagement cycle, so that you're not necessarily just having meetings in all of your council districts and noticing that the same small number of people show up at each, but that you're leveraging the resources that you have. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then also the notion of training came up a number of times, and I think there are certain forms of training that could be very worthwhile, not just for budget staff, but for staff across the organization that could help when it comes to engagement. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. So here's kind of where I think this should take us, and I want to emphasize these are my opinions. This is my professional opinion, not something that is written into any law or anything. It's just where I think this could all take us in a beneficial way. One is, I think we have to get beyond just thinking about this in terms of kind of the budget and then everything else. I think there are a lot of times when an individual decision gets brought up, a spending decision, to spend $5, 10, 15, $50 million or something, in a way that there's this sticker shock that keeps the public from being able to understand it in the broader context of how their agency is spending their money. And I think that we have to consider some protocols, maybe some standard operating procedures, some principles, some guidelines that could dictate how we could involve the public in spending decisions, not simply budget decisions, because there aren't that many folks that realize how important the budget actually is in terms of the way monies get spent. They may think it's just a plan, but then things kind of turn out differently. But in reality, budgets are the most important piece of policy that an agency ever adopts. But I think that folks get less jazzed up about the general budget and more jazzed up when a particular spending item actually comes up for approval. And so I think that I'm not saying that every decision that the council ever has on spending, or the legislature ever has, should go before the public for any kind of extended engagement process, but perhaps there's a spending threshold. Perhaps there's a threshold in terms of what it would mean in terms of change of services or programming or facility closure or what have you. But have it be more than just, we're going to talk about the budget and then we'll leave it alone for the rest of the year. Think of how all of the spending decisions that a city makes or a state makes at a certain level, or a county makes, how that might be something we should involve the public in. Again, I think developing a set of principles. I think it's very tempting to sort of have a fun, exciting, interesting way to engage the public one year, and then the next year nothing happens, or one particular aspect of the organization does some really cool out-of-the-box stuff with public engagement, and then the next department doesn't. And so I think it's important to really agree as an organization on what some of those principles will be. And when I say principles, kind of what I'm thinking of are some of these things. These are sort of themes of the principles that I found in other places, but I think they certainly could be adapted and tailored to meet the needs of your organization. But I think in the absence of that, you're sort of just giving a blank slate to a budget office or to an individual department and sort of hoping for the best. And one part of your organization may think a public hearing is just fine. Another wants to do something a lot more in depth. So having some guiding principles, I think, would be very worthwhile. I think it's critically important in this day and age to have a compelling and ongoing presence on the web that is designed both to help the public understand the way the monies are being spent. I should have written here, and to give input on it. but also have links to the full budget document. So in other words, I'm not suggesting that we do anything to hide or limit visibility of the full budget and associated documents. But I don't think that they necessarily are looking for that. I think they're looking either for spending on their particular thing that they're most concerned about, or they're concerned about just understanding it better, in layman's terms. And so I think a portal, and of course Balancing Act is kind of one of these, but a portal that has information about what monies the public is contributing, the ways in which that money is being spent, and the outcomes that we're seeing as the result of that spending, I think is something critically important to have. Now, I should hasten to add that anytime we talk about resources that are internet or web-based, we are excluding a pretty significant chunk of the population. I mean, I've seen research from Pew Research Center showing that as many as, a fifth to a quarter of the whole United States population doesn't have reliable internet access, say, at home. They may have it on a mobile phone, but they may not have it at home or at their offices. Now, libraries are a critical component of this in terms of internet access. But I just want to add that the existence of that web portal should not be considered the only way that the public can get that kind of information. Perhaps they can get it in some sort of print or other kind of form at the libraries or at the rec centers or at facilities that they are likely to frequent in the event that they don't have access to a computer. The other thing that's helpful, a lot of places have a 311 type service where you call for a non-emergency kind of information reason. And so if those operators are schooled in the web portal and understand it, then a caller can get information, and particularly in their own language, because oftentimes there are translators available for that kind of service. And so that can be a way for people to get information as well. I think it's worth considering also having some sort of ongoing group made up of members of the public that can help think about how engagement ought to occur on a particular spending decision or that particular year of the budget. I mean, there's a big difference in designing engagement when, for example, you're facing a $30 or $40 million budget shortfall that you have to address as compared to a year that you have a surplus. There's a big difference between engaging the public on the bond referendum that could cost $500 million as compared to, a single spending measure that could cost 10 or 15. And so I think it's helpful to have an advisor group because you want to, continue to grow the number of folks who are participating in these dialogues. But unless you hear from people in those populations, it can be hard to know exactly what's going to motivate them to engage. So populations of lower income folks, populations of young people, particularly pre-voting age, populations of parents with young children who are less likely to get a babysitter to go to a public meeting, senior citizens, those kinds of groups I think could be very helpful to improve your engagement. One thing that I think has been significantly underutilized in this space that I think is just a shame, and I'm working to change that, is the notion of leveraging the government access television station that just about every public agency has for means of engagement. In Austin, we've hosted several of these, and the idea is that you can watch it on your television, you can stream it, you can call in or text in or tweet in to participate, and it's an interactive live kind of meeting, but it's really meant to enable everybody to participate. Even someone without internet access can just call in. We also made a random call out to a portion of our population, and this is the kind of thing that can really involve people in decisions and in budgetary deliberations that wouldn't otherwise participate. I had a friend who once tweeted out during one of my televised town hall meetings, I just gave the kids a bath with one hand and I've got Larry Schooler's disembodied voice in my other hand, in my ear. There's a lot of different kinds of folks who, just wouldn't choose to come out or even click on a survey, but if given the chance to participate from home, with a phone call placed to their house, for example, or being able to call in, would embrace that opportunity. So I think it's important to consider that asset as something that could be leveraged for this purpose. And then there's also the idea of training community volunteers as kind of a conversation corps, which is something else we piloted in Austin, who could be given a discussion guide or could be a game board We've done something called Budget in a Box, where you give people different color stickers to indicate if they wanted to raise or lower spending, and the object of the game was to balance the budget. But there are a lot of folks in your community who I think are looking for ways to volunteer, and who also are good facilitators, who know what it takes to be good at that. And so capturing that volunteer spirit for this purpose, I think, would be very worthwhile, particularly to reach populations that might be harder to reach. So these core members could be at established events, but they could also be at popular restaurants or cafes or book clubs or knitting circles, private events. They can be sort of anywhere there could be a gathering of people. Kind of in the same vein as the web portal is the idea of a dashboard. And I want to see if I can quickly toggle over to this screen. Hopefully this is visible. Yeah, so this is a little bit of a shot of a dashboard developed by the city of Austin. And in fact, this was developed in partnership with graduates of our City Works Academy, which is a program that I think a lot of cities have now, where adults go through a sort of weekly session over a few months to learn about how the city actually works, kind of what its name implies. And they actually helped us develop what these indicators should be, both in terms of the specific topics like public safety and mobility and community services, but we also were giving them a whole list of different measures that we could use to ascertain how the city is doing in various regards, and then they weighed in on which ones would be the most meaningful. And so this kind of gets back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of presenting it in terms of outcomes rather than in terms of spending, because knowing how many police officers we have is not less significant to most people than some of the indicators you see here: how quickly they can respond, how quickly they got to life-threatening calls with a paramedic, and so on. What I like about this, it's not, this is a little bit dated and it's not very graphically compelling at the moment, and there certainly are plenty of ways to look at this or present it visually. And I think when it first came out, it had a little bit more of a visually compelling approach. But the more important thing, I think, is the content, and being able to show people, we're where we want to be in terms of this rate, or we really want to make some progress. I think it's critical to see this column here on the right that shows the goal being met or not, which is a handy way for someone to say, okay, so maybe we need to help that particular area, and think of where we could cut to make up for that. So to go back to the slide, lastly, I think just in terms of training, since that was brought up several times in the survey, I think there are a number of areas where staff could get training that would be helpful. I think one is facilitation. I think obviously there's some people like me who make their living doing facilitation. I don't think it requires that level of intensity of training. I think, though, that facilitating doesn't always come naturally to people, especially the idea of withholding your own opinions about the way money should be spent, or how it's being currently spent, or what have you. It's important to have the skill of being able to listen objectively and neutrally. And so a half day to a day training for staff in that regard, I think, would be worthwhile to kind of grow the ranks of people who could participate in these engagement processes. And then there are specialized trainings that I and others deliver that really look at the design of a public engagement process and the wide array of tools that can be deployed, some of which we've talked about here, Balancing Act, of course, being one of those tools. And then I think that there's also a separate kind of skill set. It's not necessarily a half or full day training, maybe it could be just an hour or two virtually, but the idea of moderating comments online. I think there are a lot of circumstances in which we are hearing from the public in some online fashion. So it could be a dedicated discussion page, the likes of which there are many of, but it also could be a hashtag we've put out there for people to comment on with Twitter or with Facebook or Instagram, Reddit. Sometimes, there are conversations that happen with the Ask Me Anything platform or what have you. And I think that, I've always approached moderating discussions online in a way similar to how I facilitate, which is to say to be curious, to be objective, to be neutral. But that's not something that everybody is accustomed to. Some people just want to stay away from online. They're afraid of getting into it. But my experience has consistently been that the more someone participating online sees that there's someone listening, the more it encourages participation, and that I think holds for almost any platform out there. So anyway, those are some things that I think could help with staff training that would also be able to improve and intensify or develop further your budget and spending engagement. That's all I've got for right now, and I'm happy to take questions or even comments and feedback from you all.
Well, this is Brenda again. While you guys are hopefully writing some of your questions to Larry, I'll throw one out. So, you know, Larry, we, Chris and I were face-to-face public engagement, public policy facilitators, you know, for a long time. And one of the things that, you know, we'd be brought in kind of at the moment of crises when you know, the barnstorming was about to happen. And then, you know, we'd have a public meeting, maybe a good one, and the crisis averted or over. And then, the city would say, well, that's done. And they wouldn't want to do any pronounced public engagement, because I think, like you said, there seems to be people are interested when there's something to be interested in, a spending issue, a crisis, and it's hard to justify spending the money when everything, you know, the economy's great, things are humming along, and you're not getting a lot of, you know, there's not a budget crisis, and you're not getting pushed back on spending items. And what would you say to communities that, you know, when things are going well, why do you invest in this? Because no one's coming to budget meetings, and no one's commenting on Facebook about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's funny, Brenda, because I had an experience with a client a number of years ago who had asked me to come do some training, and I just invariably will ask, you know, what prompted you to want me to come do this training? And in this particular case, it was a city I won't name. They told me that they had undertaken an infrastructure project that had to be canceled because of poor public engagement. And that cost that particular city something like $15 million. You know, I think that it sometimes takes an experience of things not going well for leadership or for, you know, other kinds of decision makers to believe that there should be something more ongoing. I also, though, think that, you know, it's hard to imagine an agency that's never going to face a difficult decision on either their budget or their tax rate or just overall services at some point or another. I mean, I'm sure if I, you know, did some sort of quantitative study of, you know, major cities around the country, they all at some point or another had something to deal with on the budget. There's never just this kind of flat line. And it's in those moments of crisis that may not seem like a crisis, maybe, but more like a difficulty, you know, bump, that having this kind of cultivated relationship and ready-made way for people to get information and understand the context comes in really handy. And I mean, the nice thing is that some of these tools are, you know, one-time investments that then may get renewed over time and you know, still benefit. I mean, for example, the Budget Basics video I was talking about earlier, you know, we produced it 1 year, and all I had to do 1 year was revoice the audio track to update a few facts and figures, but the basic video stayed exactly the same. You know, so whatever we paid for at the very beginning, which was mostly staff time anyway, was then good for several years running. And so, you know, you could build a portal that works in 2019 and then lasts you for quite a long time, or you can train these volunteers and with the right cultivation of the relationship, keep them in the mix for quite a long time. So it's not a huge upfront investment, I think, to help bring about this more ongoing relationship with the public, but it really could pay off.
Well, Larry, you've got a question from Thea, which is like the $100 million question. You know,
Thea,
these are all,
Thea, by the way,
these are great suggestions, but you know, your leadership in the city, either you're elected or your staff may not be into it. Yeah. And what about other departments that have said, you know, we don't need to, or we've always just done it a certain way. We always just hold an open house and do some charrettes. Like this is often what I see out of Public Works. Well, and that works just fine. And so any of these other kinds of things like advisory councils, not into it. What do you say to Thea?
That's a good question. First of all, I should embarrass Thea a little bit. She's not only an outstanding young leader in San Antonio, but a former City of Austin intern who I got to sit across from. So it's great to have her on. I think that first of all, a lot of the change in this arena happens because of something. Now, it could be something that happens in another city that becomes a cautionary tale. It could be something happening in your own community. A lot of cities and other agencies have made use of kind of that annual survey of just their overall services and operations, and they get feedback from the public on how things are going. And I know that that can be something that is kind of glossed over because it might be happening year after year, and what's the real significance of that? But I think that the key here is to be able to harvest some data. Maybe it's the data, maybe it's some of my data showing that this is becoming more widespread. But if not, maybe it's saying, well, look, I'm not going to make you do something more than you've already done, but let me at least do a focus group with our fill in the blank group, whether it's your City Works Academy or your mayor's cabinet or whatever. Let me at least chat with them about some of this. Let me just gather some more information. And I would bet that what you would find is that folks are interested in being a little bit more involved or being much more involved, but they just simply haven't been given the opportunity. You also could turn to or inquire of community organizations that seem to appear frequently around budget time, not necessarily to ask the city for funding or the community or the state or the county for funding, but because they're trying to advocate for more parks funding or more public safety funding or what have you, and say, well, what if you could wave a magic wand? What would you want to see happen? I mean, I think when it comes to elected officials, they're obviously going to be swayed by evidence that this is something that the public wants, and so how you go about ascertaining that, I think, is either in the form of a survey showing that they're not satisfied with services, in which case we should probably have a more in-depth conversation about that, or kind of a more focus grouped kind of conversation around the lack of understanding and accessibility of the way things are now, and a desire for it to be more accessible. When it comes to internal leadership, again, I think they're mostly going to take their cues from elected leadership, and so I'm not expecting for staff to go lobby elected officials, but certainly in a lot of cases, this is something that they're only going to buy into if they're directed to, if they're really wed to a particular set of methods. They may only do it if they're told that this is the way we do things now. You'd like that not to be the case, but if it is, it is. I mean, some people just are very hierarchical in terms of how they decide whether or not to take things in a different direction, and that's okay too. I guess the last thing that I would say is, be careful not to see it as an all or nothing proposition. In other words, I'm talking about an ambitious set of changes to make to engagement, and I think there are plenty of incremental changes that could be made that could demonstrate the greater amount of interest. So, for example, instead of having a public meeting at City Hall at 6 o'clock, maybe you've set up a booth at the most popular happy hour spot downtown at 5 o'clock. And it's not a meeting per se, it's a, stop in, get a drink, and take a 5-minute survey. Changing the design of one particular public event or set of events, say, look, you can still have your event the way you were going to have it, but let me exert a little bit more effort to try something new. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but I just would like to experiment with it. Or maybe partner with a university and say, oh, they're doing some research on what works in engagement, and this is kind of their experiment. Some students that are studying civic engagement or what have you. Or you've got a website already and it's fine, but you want to try something different. Say, let's just pilot this. I love the word pilot in government. Let's just pilot it for 3 to 6 months and see what happens. And if it doesn't change much, then okay. But if there's some change in the way things go, then maybe we can consider making it permanent. So I don't think that what I've got here at the last slide is designed to say you either do all of this or you do none of it. I think it's see where there might be a single opportunity, a single opening, whether it be with appointed or elected leadership or with the data that you already have about what the public thinks, and then leverage that to make some changes.
While in Austin, was this supported by your elected officials? Was this part of their platform, or was it initiated by staff?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that, and I'm going to get to Anthony's question here in just a minute. And in fact, that before I answer that, I think that I had a hand raised at one point, but I don't know if it's still up. So I apologize if I missed that person. But I'll get to Anthony's question in 1 second. Austin is a quirky place. For those that are on the call today from Austin, I mean, there's not an elected official in the city who can get away with, running on a platform that has anything short of a full-throated embrace of public engagement. Now, how they manifest that once they get into office can vary significantly, but there's so much public engagement even in the campaigning process in Austin that it's that much more so once things get underway. When it comes to the innovations, I mean, I think it's interesting to see how Austin undertook it. As I recall, we started with kind of that budget in the box, very kind of low tech, methodology, and eventually it progressed to an online simulation and some more in-depth, a TV town hall and so forth. So I don't think it's all going to happen at once. I think that in my particular case, I had such a close relationship with some of the folks in the finance department because they were right across the hallway from us that I was able to just kind of bounce ideas off and make some traction. But I don't know that that's always going to be the case. For one thing, there's not always a position like mine in the organization, so it can be hard to get that to happen if there's not someone there to be sort of focused on public engagement. But I think that it's okay to pull aside the aid to one of the elected officials who's making some noise about improving public engagement and say, what do you think about this idea? Would your boss support it? Could they put something up to get the direction to city manager or to other staff to do this? I think that's okay. Anthony's question is about how important I think it is to build relationships with local press to help along the path to greater transparency. And have I seen localities that have had a particularly fruitful relationship with their local press corps? Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I couldn't give you an example right now of a specific locality, but I think that in general, I don't think that localities make as high and as best use of their local press as they could. I mean, I think it goes back to kind of Brenda's example of swooping in during a crisis and then going away. I think that there should be more frequent chances for the press to interact with the agency when there's not something burning, but when there's just kind of an opportunity to visit. So 5 minutes every Monday morning with the mayor or the city manager, for example, on radio or TV. Or a column of some kind that runs every week that lays out some of the upcoming key public meetings for folks to attend. The other thing that I think is underutilized is kind of the idea of a background briefing, and it could be on the record. It's not really about it being on or off the record, but it's not a press conference. It's not a podium, with speeches and talking points and optics being a concern. It's much more about just like, take out your notepads and I'm going to kind of give you a 101 level background on our budget, on spending decisions, so that you kind of get the picture and might be inclined to do some stories eventually. It doesn't necessarily have to be an event that generates news coverage right off the bat, but I think that if you do something like that, particularly if you make it a recurring event, then they can then become an advocate. And you're asking also about a partner in creating more public engagement. I have been not surprised, but really pleased when a media outlet plays a co-convening role with a community, a city, a county, a state agency, even in getting a dialogue going. I mean, of course, Chris and Brenda have done work over the years with public broadcasting in the Colorado area in that spirit. And I just think people, despite what we may think about, distrust of the press and fragmentation, I still think that there are some key media outlets that are not just trusted, but highly appreciated. And so when, the local paper can join forces with the agency to put a compelling event together, particularly if it's covered well and promoted well in that media outlet, I just think people are more inclined to participate in it. So I highly recommend that. I've, like I said, seen examples in Denver and in Austin, and in a few other places. But I definitely think that if you give that media outlet a specific role to play, not just please put this in your paper or in your newscast, but we'd like your anchor to moderate this event, or we'd like the editorial board to ask the questions or be facilitators, or the reporters to be, or something more involved, I think that's a really worthwhile thing to do.
Well, I think we are at the end of our time. I know everybody's lunch hour may be over, but we thank you for joining us today.
Yes.
We will. This is being recorded, and we will make the slides available to those of you that have given. I think we have everybody's email, so we will. Larry, that's okay to send out
Absolutely.
the slides, I'm assuming. Yep. And you have your contact information somewhere on these slides.
You know, it's funny. I just put my email address into the chat window because I wasn't sure whether I
forgot to do that.
But,
okay,
but
so it's in the chat window.
Yeah, it's in the chat window. Please feel free to reach out, and it was great to be with you all, especially folks that I may have worked with in the past or know from past experiences. And a special thanks to Chris and Brenda. I'm really happy to join you guys for this.
Thanks to everybody, and please, if you have any questions, please let us know. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.